Tonight on Revolutionaries.
Earlier in my career, I used to say that in 50 years, everybody that doesn't play video games will be dead. So we're almost to that point.
Trip Hawkins is a pioneer of computer games. As the founder of the legendary companies 3DO and Electronic Arts, he demonstrated the vision and creativity to capture a global audience. John Markoff of the New York Times talked to Hawkins about his early career, his business strategy, and his path to becoming a revolutionary. Major funding for Revolutionaries is provided by the Intel Corporation.
So Trip has been in the news a lot recently. I think you gave a keynote in London yesterday. That's very recently. It's been picked up, so I already read about it. And he's got another company. We'll get to that. But I wanted to trace the arc of how you got there. And I first met Trip as a cub reporter when I was at a newspaper, a computer newspaper called InfoWorld. And a man by the name of John Dvorak was my editor. You can imagine what it's like to work for John Dvorak. And we visited Trip in San Mateo. And I came away really quite taken with the idea of his new company, which was Electronic Arts at that point, because he was going to turn programmers into rock stars. And we had just left the hobbyist phase of the industry. And you know, where did that idea come from? The idea that programmers should be rock stars?
Well, I'd been at Apple, of course, for those 4 years, and had worked with guys like Bill Atkinson and Larry Tesler, and just realized working with immense talents like that these were prima donna divas, just like they are in every other art form.
Yeah.
And that games were a legitimate art form, so why not think of them as artists, and why not bring a lot of the business practices from Hollywood into engineering and computer science.
And I was trying to think about how that's worked out. Here we are 3 decades later now, and there clearly are some rock stars. There's John Carmack and Sid Meier and Will Wright, but it's not quite the music business, is it? Or
obviously they're not performers. Yeah. So clearly, when you talk about different art forms and celebrity, if there's a performance, if you're a musician or a TV star or a movie star, that's where the cult of celebrity really kicks into gear. Yeah. So I think the real aficionados are really curious about how games get made, and they want to know who made them and what they were thinking, and they enjoy learning the background about it. But the general public, not so much.
Okay. Yeah. What brought you to gaming as a kid?
I think we all play games when we're kids. I just felt differently about it than most people.
But isn't there kind of some switch? I mean, I've always thought, even amongst boys, that there's some of us are gamers and some not, and the people who aren't gamers can't get it at all, and the people who are gamers can't do anything but. At least that's the way it seemed to me.
Well, video games have become that way, but I think we all grew up playing the same card games and board games.
Were you at Avalon Hill?
Yeah, of course. Of course.
Stalingrad?
Although I kind of discovered that later on. So I'm thinking about when I'm 5 or 6 or 7 years old and playing games like Monopoly and whatnot.
Sports games?
Well, a little bit later on.
Okay.
So one of the first things that happened to me, even when I was very young, so I realized that I was really switched on mentally when I was playing board games or card games. And this was the golden age of television, and everybody wanted to watch TV, and I could just tell that I was dumbing myself down when I was watching TV, and I was getting way more invigorated when I was playing games. So I just appreciated the learning power of it and the power of creativity and imagination. And that's now been validated by brain scientists that have proven that the single best way to increase human intelligence is through interaction. So it was difficult for me because when I found the card, chart, dice games like D&D and Avalon Hill and the early sports equivalent of that, which for me, the game that I really enjoyed was Stratomatic. Any Stratomatic players out there? All right, we got at least one.
Literally.
Anyway, that's what I wanted to do because you felt incredibly powerful. I mean, first of all, you're controlling your heroes. You're projecting yourself into the roles that your sports heroes are playing, and you're controlling the entire team and controlling the roster and the strategies and the plays. I found that very empowering. But then a lot of kids didn't want to do it because all those games that we just described, they don't have a computer. So you have to be the computer to keep track of everything.
So you
and it's very laborious. And they would go, no, I'm going to go watch TV.
So did you grow up in Pasadena?
I was born in Pasadena, and we lived in Sierra Madre, it's a little town right near there.
And what about your family? What did your folks do? Were you middle class, upper middle class? What kind of technical family? Where did you come from?
They were both college graduates, and my dad worked for an early electronics company in LA.
Okay.
And he worked in sales and marketing. My mom was way smarter than my dad, and she had been valedictorian of her college class. And of course, this was in the 50s, and was really ticked off when she discovered she couldn't get a job any better than being a secretary.
Yeah.
So she settled for marriage.
Yeah.
And this is a true story. She started a family. Yeah. And she was a voracious reader. And then later on went back and got a PhD in history and ended up winning an Emmy Award.
Yeah. Were your parents the reason you ended up at Harvard? Why not Stanford? What took you to the East Coast?
I kind of regret the whole thing. My brother was at Stanford, and I kind of didn't want to be in the same place with him, which was stupid. I mean, just right there, that was a bad judgment call. It would have been great to have been there. Yeah. And then I was fortunate to go to graduate school at Stanford and appreciate what a great place it was, and been kicking myself ever since.
Right. I wanted to jump back for a second. Were you also into athletics in terms of playing?
Yeah, I was a football player.
Really?
So that's what really drove my interest in football simulation games.
Yeah. Do you remember that silly little football game?
Of course. I had them all. I didn't know which one you're getting to. I bought every conceivable board, card, thing with the lights. And,
the light one.
Things that vibrate.
The vibrate one.
I had them all. Every single one.
They were great. Yeah, they were great.
But which one were you going to talk about?
Well, I was going to talk about the vibrate one first, because that was the first one I had.
That was totally lame. You couldn't do anything with it.
A little cotton football with the little... But then there was the light one where they gave you little templates
I know, and
for the plays.
that was actually a good game.
Yeah, that was very
That was a good game. And that you'd sort of peel it off, and the light would come out, and you'd see the tacklers, and are they going to intercept the light? I mean, that was very clever.
You did play them all. That's pretty good. So you went to Harvard, and you designed your own major? Was that...
Yeah, so by the time I got there, I already had decided I was going to do this.
Yeah.
So this is just a weird, unusual thing. There's a lot of things I do not understand even as we speak. And there are a lot of, I think, normal things that other people understood early and young that it took me extra decades to figure out. But I figured out what I wanted to do for a career really, really early.
Which was to create games.
So I'd already gotten into designing games like Stratomatic, and of course focused on football because that was my big hobby interest. And when I heard that you could actually do this on a computer, I thought, okay, well I'm going to do that. And there was this moment, by the way, that's I think an important part of the whole story is that I got a summer job for a couple of years while I was in college working for System Development Corporation in Santa Monica, which had been spun out of Rand Corporation. It was kind of their practical computer services deal. And one of my colleagues came back from lunch one day and he said, hey, you're not going to believe this. I was just in a computer store. And this is Paul Heiser's The Computer Store. This was the first computer retail store. Happened to be in Santa Monica. This is the kind of stuff that really reinforces your belief in God. When crap like this happens again and again and again, you just feel, okay, you're being guided on a certain path. And of course, anybody here remember the KSR 33?
I do.
Okay, well, for example, there was one of those hooked up to my buddy's PDP-8 kit, and that's what I was used to using.
You were home for the summer.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I'm in a job where I have access to that kind of thing, and that's what I'd had at school. Or you might get a IBM terminal with one of those green phosphor tubes in it. But anyway, you could rent a KSR 33 from his shop for $10 an hour of connect time. It was like, wow, that is so cool. It's a home computer. So anyway, this colleague of mine, his name was Paul, kind of blew my mind with that. And then he said, well, that's not all. Shoot, there's a company that just figured out how to put a whole CPU on a chip. Of course, this is 1975, this is Intel. So my mind was completely blown, and I go back to my desk and I sit there and I start noodling, and I go, okay, great, the game's afoot. How long is it going to take for enough of this equipment to get into homes that there'll be a big enough market to support a company to make games? And I decided it would be 1982. So this is 1975, and I'm saying, okay, I'm going to start my company in 1982.
Yeah. So from Harvard to Stanford, was that just?
Yeah. So with that AccuStat thing, I had borrowed $5,000 from my father, and I lost every penny of it, and had a great time. Wanted to do it again, but I thought maybe I should actually figure out how to do it. And I thought, all right, well, again, I come from a family that believes in education, so all right, let's go get an MBA, which is kind of laughable. You don't learn how to do things in the real world from being in school. And the funny thing about that, of course, is there I am at Stanford Business School for 2 years while guys like Bill and Steve have dropped out and are already in the industry. Yeah. But the funny part of that paid off is that when I got over to Apple, and this got started in 77, because I realized, hey, there's this market research firm, Creative Strategies, down here in San Jose, and they're still there.
Sure.
And I'm going to go convince them to let me write a study. Nobody's done a study of personal computing. So, of course, I go pitch them that idea. And they said to me, what's a personal computer?
This is Creative or Apple?
No, Creative Strategy.
Creative, yeah.
Yeah, they had no idea. And they said, nobody wants to know about that.
This is
but
77?
This is 77.
Wow.
But we have customers that want to buy a study about computer printers. If you'll do a study on computer printers, then we'll talk about this other thing later.
Oh, no.
So I did that, and it was their best-selling study ever. Naturally, there was this new thing called a dot matrix printer.
Yeah.
And I'd forecast that segment of the market to grow 35% a year for 5 years. Or I think I'd forecast a little higher. And they said, no, you need to take those numbers down. None of our customers are going to believe it. Of course, the reality was it was way, way, way higher because they got hitched up with personal computers, right? That's great. So anyway, they eventually let me do the study on personal computing. That allowed me to go around and knock on all the doors and meet all the companies in the space. Several of them ended up giving me job offers. Because anyway, I'm not an engineer. You know, why would they hire me? And then I fully intended to go back in and knock the doors down at Apple. And when my study was ready to go, I sent out little marketing flyers to a lot of the companies, including Apple. So naturally, just because this is how he is, Steve Jobs called me at home. Those were the days when, you could actually call directory assistants or just look people up in the phone book. Yeah. He calls me at home and immediately starts berating me about the study because this little marketing flyer had pointed out that Radio Shack had sold more machines.
Which was true.
And they were running an ad at the time that said Apple was the best-selling personal computer. And it was making, my statement is making them look bad. Yeah. So he just gets on the phone with me. He doesn't know me. He just starts getting in an argument right away. I said, well, I'd be happy to come down to show you the study and talk about it further. Okay. So that's how I get the job offer at Apple. And then
was it originally to be marketing and strategy person, or what was your first entry?
Yeah, it was actually called, I think it was called Manager of Market Planning.
And Steve did the interview?
Well, I talked to all of the guys. Yes, yeah. But Mike Markle, of course, who gets nowhere near as much credit as he should get for the whole thing that happened there. Yeah. And it trivializes his role to just say he was the adult supervision, but he was the adult supervision. Yeah. Anyway, so he was my first boss, but I was working very closely with Steve Jobs. And on my second day, Markle had me come into his office and he said, look, at that point we had about 25 office workers. There's another 25 employees in the back assembling Apple IIs, and we had assembled and sold about 1,000 Apple IIs before I got there. And the machine at that time, it cost $2,000. It was basically a hobby machine because it couldn't really do anything. And it had 4 kilobytes of RAM in it. And no display, no disk drive, no mass storage of any kind, no printers, no modems, no nothing. Yeah. They had it was, of course, a brilliant product design with the slots and so on. Anyway, so Markoff calls me in and says, hey, you know something about business. And I'm going, figure out how we can sell these to businesses.
So you were the
So
first.
that was my job. And the first thing I thought was, well, we must have warranty cards. Let's go find out if any businesses have bought them. So I go find the customer service person, and here's the stack of the cards. I got the entire history of warranty cards sent in by Apple customers. There's, I don't know, maybe 100 of them. And there were 13 businesses. I thought, and originally I was thinking, hey, I'm going to go get a bunch of these warranty cards, and I'll design a questionnaire, and I'll send it out to them. I'm just going to call them. It's only 13. So I'm calling these people up. Yeah, okay, it's a plumber. Okay, well, what are you doing with it? I'm playing Star Trek. Okay, this was that text-only thing, with the little K means a Klingon ship, and you had to load it in from audio cassette tape.
Yep.
So he's got basically a $2,500 Star Trek game machine. Okay, then I talked to another guy that ran a retail store. He was going to program his own point-of-sale system and accounts receivable, accounts payable, et cetera. Anyway,
So
they were all
2 years before VisiCalc at this point. Is it 2 years?
about maybe a year and a half.
Okay.
So it was clear that this is just a total hobby market. Nobody's yet doing anything meaningful with the machines.
Yeah.
And I think the most important thing I figured out in the really early going was all of the discussion at that time was about how, well, big companies use them for accounting, and medium-sized companies then use them for accounting, and then mini computers are used by smaller companies, and there were some companies starting to bring the price point of an accounting computer system down to maybe $30,000.
Yeah.
And everyone's saying, oh, well, as the computers get smaller and cheaper, then they can do accounting for smaller businesses. And I thought about it, having talked to these 13 characters and just what I knew about small business people, and I thought, there's no way they could handle that. It's just way too complicated.
But you were around for the VisiCalc and the WordStar,
Well, that's what I was going to say is that I drove this diversion where it said, okay, forget about the idea of accounting, which is what that's what the conventional wisdom was. Let's go do the Office desktop.
So I saw one interview. You described this story about Steve walking by you once and asking you if you'd ever taken LSD.
Oh, yeah.
Well, tell us about that.
Well, I had a lot of fun moments like that with Steve, but I think he'd probably been in a meeting where somebody was preventing him from doing what he wanted. His title at that time was Vice President of Product Development, but he was without portfolio. He didn't really have any actual power. In fact, at the end of my first week there, Markle and I were standing in the hall, and down the hall there's Steve darting around. And I just said to Mike, I said, we really need to do something about that. And he said, yes, but come here. He pulls me into his office and says, you have no idea what I was dealing with a few years ago. I mean, this guy didn't know how to set a place setting at a table. He had no hygiene. He was like a wild man out of the jungle.
Right.
And, you just say, yeah, don't worry, it's going to be okay. We're civilizing him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, he was quite a character. But to come back to the LSD thing, so anyway, Steve was probably in a meeting, wanted to get something to happen his way, it probably got shot down, and somebody must have used an argument against him that had something to do with what I'd said. Yeah. So he's probably a little pissed off at me. And he's thinking, yeah, if Tripp had just dropped acid, I wouldn't be having this problem with this guy. So he came over and he sort of pokes his head, and I said, hey, Tripp, have you ever taken LSD? And he goes, no. And he said, yeah, I thought so. And he walks off. But we had a lot of fun.
It sounds like you actually, you worked with him.
Yeah.
It was, and there.
We'd be sitting in his office, and Andy Grove would call and complain about us hiring yet another engineer or product manager out of Intel, and Steve would kind of hold the phone. Andy's yelling really loud, and we would just, be chuckling together.
That's so funny because my first interaction with Steve Jobs, I walked into Paul Freiberger's office at InfoWorld, and Paul was about to report the code names of the Mac and Lisa in '82, and he was holding the phone away from his ear because Steve was screaming at him. So anyway, it's even more remarkable now. So here you are on this track toward Lisa and Macintosh and that world, which was a huge world, but you took off and you went off orthogonally. Amazing software. is what you've, so tell us about why you jumped when you jumped. And you, well, obviously.
Well, it was January 1st, 1982.
Oh, sorry. Time to go.
And I slid my resignation under Steve's door and John's door and Markoff's door. And of course, they tried to talk me out of it. But frankly, to be fair, I was kind of a rival with Steve. Yeah. And Steve didn't want me to have very much power. Yeah. So they weren't going to give me a really big job, just for that reason. And you know, they tried to offer me some exciting things to do. And I had a tremendous conflict about leaving because they'd been so good to me. I mean, you know, heck, I mean, it was just an unbelievable opportunity. I was really lucky to have been able to be there. And when I first went to Apple, I thought I'd be there for a year. And so it had been such a ride. You know, it had grown to 4,000 employees and about $1 billion a year run rate. But that's, you know, I wanted to go do my thing, and it was time. But you know what, they were sincerely interested in convincing me not to stay, and so I rescinded the resignation, and I started working on some of the things they asked me to work on. But it really just wasn't meant to be, and it was in that interval that a colleague came in and said, "Hey Tripp, I saw this magazine on the airplane, and you should read this article about blah blah blah." Okay, so I read that article, and then I noticed another article, which was an interview with Don Valentine. Okay. And I was particularly intrigued with the bit where it said that he's very intimidating, and that a visitor had come into his office for a meeting and had been so intimidated that he'd passed out. And I thought, I got to meet this guy. I just thought, yeah, this is the kind of guy that will be able to tell me whether or not I can start my own company, and whether my ideas are any good, and whether or not it's okay to. Because I was even worried about, it's going to be okay for me to leave Apple now, where I've worked on this Lisa project all this time, but it's not really finished. Right. Anyway, I went and talked to him, and pretty much Don said, you should leave as soon as possible and get started on this. And I did, you know, within a month after that.
Yeah. So going from Amazing Software, which was your original.
Yeah, that was the original name.
And you ended up at Electronic Arts. You almost were software artists for a while?
Yeah, so the first several employees didn't really care for the amazing name. You know, the funny thing about names is that, you know, it's like when you name a child even. Initially, the name doesn't have a lot of gravitas, but after a while you think, well, of course that's the name. Yeah. You know, I think in a lot of ways it's kind of arbitrary. Yeah. But the big idea was the software artist. And of course, they were like, okay, well, why don't we call it soft art or some derivative of that? But there was already the guys who made VisiCalc were you know, software artists. Yeah. So anyway, I don't remember exactly, but there's a pretty good chance that I suggested the word electronic, right. And then there was some debate of electronic artists versus electronic arts. Yeah. And one of the things that we had done at Apple, in fact, it was one of the things I'd actually done at business school as well, was go down to Pajaro Dunes and, you know, have meetings and stuff. And so I took the first dozen employees that we had by that time. We all went down to Pajaro Dunes to talk about strategy and how we're going to launch things. And we thought, all right, well, we're going to come up with we're going to finalize a new name before we actually ship any products. And everybody gets one vote, but if you go to bed, you lose your vote. And we're not going to finish it until everybody agrees. And we didn't resolve it until 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah. But it was Electronic Arts.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you know, what was your first sort of monster hit? What originally made?
Well, you know, there really wasn't one because there wasn't a platform on which you could really have one. So the Atari 2600, the original VCS or video computer system, the console, there were hits on that because they sold millions of those machines, and there were hits like Pac-Man, right. And so on, Defender, you know, et cetera. But we didn't want to make anything for that machine. Literally, I think that machine had 256 bytes of memory. There was not a lot you could do. And it could only do 6 sprites. So that means you could only really light a few things on the screen at a time. And so as soon as you started having more activity on the screen, they would all start flickering, but you couldn't draw them in every frame, you know?
God.
So, and they were manufacturing cartridges at very high cost for the ROM chips, so we didn't want to do that. And what actually kind of shocked me was that the first generation of Activision, they got really big during that generation, but people didn't seem to realize that that was kind of a wave that was going to peter out, and they were able to take it public, they raised a lot of money, and then they just drove it straight into the ground because they stayed on that machine, and they wrote it up and they wrote it down, and went bankrupt. You know, and we were sort of waiting for the next generation, and we got started on machines like the Apple II and the Atari 800, and then Commodore came out with the Commodore 64, but there was no floppy disk drive. So one of the bigger bets that I made with the company in the early days was saying, okay, we're going to commit a bunch of projects to the Commodore 64, presuming that by the time they're finished, there will be enough disk drives available. And there was a backup plan that if that didn't work, like Archon, that was a really fabulous early game.
Yeah.
We could have actually run that off cassette tape.
Yeah.
But we wanted it to be on floppy disk. So there's kind of a backup plan in case the floppy didn't have. But the Commodore 64 floppy disk did really well. So I think a lot of people would say Skyfox was the first hit because, in fact, that was a project that Woz ran into it at an Apple Fest in Boston. And Ray Toby was the artist that had created it, and he said, "Oh, you got to talk to Tripp." And you know, I loved it, and Stuart Bond produced it. And that game, when it came out on the Commodore 64, that was a machine that had enough of an installed base. And this is kind of funny because it was at a $200 machine, and then you could pay $200 for the disk drive, so about $400, and then you'd hook it up to a TV. And the disk drive was unbelievably slow. In fact, one of the journalists, I don't know if you remember this, but somebody once really nailed it. They said they flipped the floppy disk, which transferred data only slightly faster than you could type it in by hand. And that was exactly on the money. But yeah, enough of those floppy disks got sold, and then Skyfox, that was in '84. That was a real #1 hit with good volume.
You did something with respect to Sega that turned out to be a really powerful business move. You reversed engineered.
Yeah, that was later.
That was much later?
Well, what happened is that in the mid-'80s, Nintendo revived the console market.
Yeah.
And they had a very draconian business model. Right. So here we are, we can put out 40, 50 products a year. We can buy on whatever platforms we wanted. We had all the creative freedom we wanted. We also had low manufacturing costs because we were on floppy disks. And Nintendo comes along and says, okay, this is a closed system. If you want to know how it works, you have to sign a license agreement. Nobody had done that before. I mean, IBM did that to prevent the IBM-compatible companies from copying them faster. But you know, in terms of media, you know, the media examples you had were things like television, you know, the NTSC broadcast standard, or you know, audio cassette tape, and pretty much these things were open, and there might be a tiny, tiny, tiny little licensing fee to you know, press a disc or whatever, and that continued all the way through music CD. But Nintendo said, no, this is a closed system, and we're going to charge like a $10 per unit license fee. And then it's cartridge, so that's going to be another $10 of cost, and it's going to have a dinky little memory footprint. Yeah. And, oh yeah, you can make 5 games a year, and we're going to have to approve the games in advance, and then we, Nintendo, are going to control the manufacturing, and we're going to put it on a boat. And the boat could literally get halfway across the ocean, and you've realized that the demand's not enough, and you want to hire a bomber to go sink the boat. You know? So what happened in the late 80s was that the success of Nintendo at the consumer level was shifting the market. And a company, Tengen, which was an Atari division, they said, screw it, you know, we've ordered these units from Nintendo, and it's been 8 months, and they haven't shipped us yet, and we're just sick and tired of waiting, and we don't like it. And so they just basically said, well, we reverse engineered the machine, and we're going to make our own games and not be under the license. But they had previously signed a license, so they ended up losing their case. Yeah. But I was inspired by the story. Yeah. It got me thinking. Yeah. And then in late '88, that's when the Sega Mega Drive, their 16-bit system, shipped in Japan. And Sega did not have any market share at the 8-bit level, nor did they have a third-party license agreement. But I'm thinking, okay, with the 16-bit machine could be really exciting. It was using the Motorola MC68000 processor. We were very familiar with that processor from the Commodore Amiga, the Atari ST, the Mac, et cetera. And this is a product that would sell for less than $200. So we got a hold of the Japanese product, and we looked at it, and it didn't have some of the problems Nintendo had. So if you're looking at Nintendo and you're thinking about reverse engineering it, they had a patented security chip that would handshake between the cartridge and the machine. And there wasn't really a practical way to get around that patent, but Sega didn't have anything like that. And of course, sometimes, like Nintendo didn't have that security chip in their Japanese model, and they shipped a different model in the US market that had it. So I said, all right, this is a little bit like if you're familiar with the Lawrence of Arabia movie, where we're going to attack Aqaba from the rear, and we're going to have to cross the Nafud Desert, which has never been crossed. It was literally that kind of thing, because the guys that had to do what I wanted them to do, to reverse engineer it, to do a clean room, they have to be willing to never make games for that machine, because they violated copyright law in order to decompile it and look at code listings. What they're allowed to do, the reason that's considered fair use, is that they're not then exploiting that information themselves. They're just writing down what they learned, and then that comes out as like a little book that somebody else can use to make a game. Right. But you don't get to do it because you had access to the copyright.
Yourself. Yeah.
And so this is a real heroic thing to do. I mean, to take on this assignment, and I'm just forever indebted to Jim Nichols, who's no longer with us, but his work was particularly heroic in figuring it out. And of course, once we had it figured out, then we're worried that the US model is going to come out a few months later, because it took us almost a year to figure it out. Wow. And now the US model is going to come out, and we're just praying and crossing our fingers, hoping that it's just like the Japanese model, and sure enough, it is. Wow. And then now we're training our developers on how to make games for it. And we had a whole lineup of games in manufacturing within about 6 months. Yeah. And then we're ready to come to market. We're taking orders. We got our packaging design, and we're heading into the CES. And then I thought, all right, now I have to go tell Sega what we're up to. And they've been courting us for over a year, and we'd have these sort of bullshit meetings without admitting what's going on. And I just kept telling them what I didn't like about their license agreement, and whatever. But it's finally, okay, we're on the 11th hour of coming to market. And I called him up and said, hey, we can just do this on our own, and we'll see you in court. Or we can go into the market together, side by side, as brothers, and we can go kick Nintendo's butt. And, of course, they didn't immediately cotton to that idea. So, we had some pretty tense meetings, and they tried to huff and puff and blow our house down and scare us and whatnot.
But they came around, and it was...
Yeah, here's the funny part of the story is that we're heading off to the CES trade show in Chicago in June of 1980. No, 1990. And I'm huddled up there for a whole day just before the show is going to open with Jamie Cook, who is the general counsel for Sega. And we hammered out a license agreement. And one of the provisions of it was that there was a cap on how much we'd ever have to pay them that I insisted on. So we said, okay, we'll pay you $2 a unit. Everybody else is going to pay like $10 or $12 a unit. We'll pay you $2 a unit. We can make as many games as we want. We're going to do our own manufacturing, a whole bunch of other things about how we're going to operate. But by the way, after we've ever paid you $2 million, that's it. We're done. And that turned out to be a major difference maker in the next 5 years of profitability for the company. And there was a moment before those negotiations got finished where my entire management team said to me, Tripp, you've done a really great job in this. Don't insist on that cap. Look at this. We can live with this $2 deal. Just, don't insist on the cap. And I said to them, I'm pretty sure I can get this, and it might take another 6 months, or maybe even a year, because they might feel like they need to see us come to market, get really pissed off, sue us, and we'll start the discovery process for the lawsuit, and then after that they'll agree to it. Well, I had the agreement like within 10 days.
Oh my God, that's great. So we have to skip forward about 20 years very quickly, but before we do, I just want to ask you if you remember Infocom's marketing slogan. This is a way of getting to 3DO, but
I'm going to remember as soon as you say it, because I remember their ads.
the best graphics are in your mind.
That's right. And they had the picture of the brain.
Talk just a little bit about 3DO, and it ultimately didn't take the world over, but was it just a case of you being too early, or was it business?
Yeah, it was definitely early. It was a noble King Arthur type deal where the hardware industry was really stagnated.
Thank you.
And I had gone around and talked to everybody. In fact, Microsoft had put together a major platform opportunity with IBM, and they were going to try to make a more multimedia-oriented home computer, and that fell apart and didn't go anywhere. And there were, a lot of the manufacturers just weren't going to do anything. Nobody really brought any imagination yet to optical disc media, 3D graphics, multimedia uses of computers, et cetera. So you had Nintendo using color and Sega using color, for example, and then on the PC side, it was pretty much a business market, and nobody really seemed to want to break out of that. So it just seemed like, well, somebody really should do something, and EA was powerful enough that we could lead the charge in actually doing something. And we actually found the guys that had done the Atari Lynx. So these are guys that had previous experience doing custom chips and game design. And we set up a contracting arrangement with them, and for a year it was just kind of a skunk works working on it. But the idea was to move the hardware forward in optical disc storage, in 3D graphics, and networking, and to have a more progressive license agreement and sort of a milder version of the Nintendo formula with much lower license fees. Right. And I think one of the errors in judgment that I made was I thought, well, hey, the VCR, everybody paid $500 or $1,000 for a VCR, and they pay $500 plus for a TV or for a hi-fi system. This is going to be a multimedia system. It's certainly worth that much. You fast forward to today. I mean, Apple just introduced a new version of the iPad that costs $500. Yeah. But clearly, two things were true. Number one, it just wasn't powerful enough to really get that kind of a price tag. And then secondly, people really didn't understand why they would want one. Yeah. So the only application that had a developed market was console-type video games, and that market was accustomed to paying $200 or less. So the price was too high, and a lot of the technologies were a little too expensive.
So if you could turn the clock back, knowing what you know now, was it just a price? Would price have changed it, or I mean, what would you have done?
Well, here's the most fundamental thing: is that the concept of 3DO was that it would be like a Dolby licensing business, and it would have big, brawny hardware and software partners. Yeah. And I put a lot of those partners together, but collectively, 3DO had like $100 million in capital, and then Sony came in and spent $2 billion, and they built an enormous fab, and they knew that memory prices were coming down and that disk drive prices would come down, yeah. And they just put an enormous bet on the table, yeah. And then they executed really, really well, yeah. And the consortium, it would be harder to get any consortium to execute as well as one company like Sony executed. So yeah. There you go. $2 billion is a lot of money.
I want to go to the future, but before I go there, was Digital Chocolate, which was your previous company, was it a play specifically on mobility?
Yes.
And where so there was this explosion of mobile apps and games, and is that where this generation of interactive games stays forever? So I mean, it's got a lot of force now. It probably has undermined, to some extent, the console market to the future.
Yeah, when I first started Digital Chocolate, I talked about the mobile phone as the social computer, and that's exactly what it's turned out to be. Everybody used to live in a little tribe or village, and they had a perfect social life, and you saw the same intimate friends every day, and that's all gone now. Yeah. And so that's why in the last 30 years there's been just tremendous demand for new forms of social products and services. And the mobile phone is one of the linchpins of that, and of course social networks are another one. And the issue that I think Digital Chocolate had again was it was in some ways too early, in some ways too late. Because I came in with a business plan that was based on things that I'd always cared about, like virtual goods and networking and multiplayer, social games. And they'd been going gangbusters in Japan. And what happened is that Docomo is a company kind of in the same class as Apple in terms of classy, elegant, and innovative thinking. And they pioneered a whole bunch of stuff. I mean, they had the first App Store. They really invented the App Store. And they had a very egalitarian kind of cloud-based model of how they did that. And they only took 10% of the revenue, and they took care of all the payment. So again, if you look at what Apple introduced to the App Store, a lot of the features of it were really a derivative of Docomo. The Koreans, SKT, just copied the whole thing that happened in Japan, and then nobody else in the world did it. The rest of the world happens, the mobile operators got really greedy and were kind of lazy about technology and innovation and greedy about how much of the revenues they wanted from apps. So by the time Digital Chocolate shows up, the Western operators, the mobile operators like Verizon and Vodafone, we're talking about social applications and virtual goods and going, well, we don't have a billing system that can do microtransactions. And what do you mean, social apps? What are you talking about? They just didn't get it. Yeah. I actually pitched them on a farming app, a social farming app in 2004, and they laughed us out of the room.
Oh, dear.
And they were complete monopolists. I mean, you could not reach the consumer if you didn't go through them. Yeah. So we were too early for that, and then basically, well, we've got a puzzle game section. Can you make some puzzle games? Because they had a few little merchandising categories of traditional casual games. But Jamdat had already been doing that for 3 years. Gameloft had already been doing that for 3 years. So we're kind of caught in between.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not quite, I want to get to these questions, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the future of gaming and through where you're going. So when you talk about social gaming, it makes me think of ubiquitous computing. And my sense of ubiquitous computing is that computing drops out of the equation and everyday things become magic. And we still have gaming in that world. And so it's maybe it's even more immersive than it was before because you've got the entire real world if you can design the games correctly. I don't know if that's where you're going, but I wondered sort of if you could talk a little bit about sort of both the sociology and the technology for what's past consoles or past, the thing in your hand. And is that the name of your, if I can, your new company?
So in about a month, if you're interested, you can look for it. We're launching an educational game service for kids. It's called If.
If.
And it's inspired by the Kipling poem.
Okay.
That poem starts, if you can keep your head while all about you are losing theirs. So we have that as a trademark in our trade class. But under California law, you have to have a unique corporate name regardless of trade class. So we expanded it to the first 3 words of the poem. So it's If You Can Company.
I see.
The service is called
If.
And so for me, the shift there is towards education, which is always, it's like the first thing I realized about my experience playing games was the learning power. And even in the early days at EA, there was a balance in terms of there being products that were creative and imaginative and educational, like Music Construction Set, and the sports games that were more purely about entertainment. And there was obviously a business model with EA Sports where you're bringing in data about the sport and specifications about the sport and experts that are co-designing it, and you're mating that up with great game developers that know the technology, the tools, and the game mechanics and how to put that all together. And it didn't really happen before in education. And if you think about the educational world, the guys on the academic side, they're accustomed to students being trapped like prisoners in the classroom. And there are a lot of great teachers. I'm not trying to say anything negative about teachers, but that didactic system, which has been around for 500 years, it just doesn't work anymore in an environment where everyone has a mobile device and has mobile addiction. The odds of people that are now accustomed to interacting with computers, paying attention to a teacher doing a lot of talking, not real good. And then you're expected to go home and do a lot of supplementary reading, not real good. And the academics have actually been intrigued with game technology for a long time, but none of them really understand that the first thing that has to happen is the entertainment. And the standard of excellence in entertainment is very, very high. So they're really not that familiar with how competitive a standard that is. But if you know how to make great entertainment, then you're going to engage the public. And once you've got their attention, because learning is about attention, number one, and motivation, number two. And motivation needs to be intrinsic and autonomous. So you've kind of automatically got that in a game. Now, the reason we tried to do this 30 years ago, and it didn't really go anywhere, and I'll be honest, I think the reason is the schools weren't really shopping, and the women weren't shopping. So this is just a huge game changer in human history, is that women had always been in charge of buying the practical appliances that had some actual functional value. They wanted to control those purchases, and the things like the TV and the hi-fi and the computer, that's all the stuff we're goofing off. Yeah. Let the guys figure that out. And that had held true for a real long time. So Apple then starts to get women to use the iPod and deal with their music libraries. And then the iPhone comes out, and they get them hooked into the App Store. And pretty soon their kids are asking to borrow the devices. And the women started to take over technology buying in the home. So this is a whole new deal to have this happen and have them sort of governing what apps kids are using. So this is a really powerful change in the market. So the platforms are good enough now. Like one example in education is that you'd like to have characters in a game talk and hear their voices so that an early reader is getting their reading skills reinforced instead of having it be impossible to figure out what's going on. So the technology is right. The customers are ready and interested. And I think the game industry's always known how to do it, but just has never bothered to do it. I mean, it was done with typing tutors. So right in the very, very early going, okay, learning to type, that's valid curriculum. And there were many examples like my friend Bruce Zweig and his game Master Type, where it's a game mechanic and you're typing, and of course there's also assessment. It can tell what you're typing and whether or not it's correct, and it can tell what speed you're going. And computers are great at keeping track of data and recording everything that's going on. But there are really very few other examples. Now, you have some great products like SimCity that have tremendous learning power, but there was no curriculum intention or any curriculum alignment, and there's no assessment, right? So all this time went by, and I think, you know what? I think the real reason, like, why did I make EA Sports? Because those are games I wanted to play. And it's a young man's industry. It's kind of a Logan runs industry, and it's all these young men that want to make games that they want to play. And many of them haven't even been married yet, much less had children. They don't understand mothers, they don't understand kids, and they don't care. So I feel in a way like I spent 20 years preparing to start EA, and I've got 2 boys and 2 girls, and I've been a parent for 20 years. And I've spent 20 years basically preparing to do this. And what I believe there's a number of breakthroughs that can be made here that include using that same EA Sports formula to bring in the right experts on curriculum, and again, knit all the different ingredients together to just do it with real curriculum and do it with real assessment and prove that it actually works. And I think it's a model that can be applied to a whole lot of curriculum.
And age range, where are you going to head?
Okay, so in our case, we're focused on 6 to 12-year-olds.
Okay.
And we're teaching a specific curriculum. We haven't announced a lot of the details about it yet. But again, I think we're going to attempt to make some breakthroughs in this area. And I think if it has any kind of traction or success, it'll wake up a lot of people. And a lot of people will realize that now's the time to go flesh out this market for education. And
this is about interactivity and computer technology. You're not going back to cards or anything like that. This is about...
Yeah, so in fact, we're going to launch specifically on the iPad, although we're going to be on every device next year.
As feature films and games converge, do you see a new opportunity for a new game console for movie theaters? If so, what do you think the experience could be like for attendees in a theater interactively experiencing a feature film together?
Yeah, I think that there's a really, really good chance, whether it's your own personal device that you happen to bring into the theater or there's something built into the theater, I think there's all kinds of fun opportunities for getting people more involved in a group experience like that.
Yeah. What do you think of the rise of the mobile games industry, and do you think game consoles still have a place in our living rooms?
There's going to be a really interesting battle for the living room in the next 5-10 years, and this is where smart TV will come in, and that'll be the next big device market. And I think the open internet is going to win. Just that, a lot of the stakeholders that are determined to have it be more proprietary, I think they're going to lose their edge.
With digital chocolate, you've now spent 10 years in mobile games. What do you think of EA's efforts in that space? If you were still at EA, would you be doing anything different?
There's a huge transition happening in the game industry where the old school business, which was packaged goods distribution and very high performance, hardcore console type games. So that's been declining for 5 years, and I believe it's going to just continue to tail off. And I think of it as a large hobby market, a little bit like there are people that would like to know how to fly an airplane and that actually own airplanes. The rest of us just want to be passengers. Yep. There are people that really like having a stick shift car and feeling the road. The rest of us want an automatic. And the console games are just, it's a really deep, committed experience. And most of the public, including the hardcore gamers, as they get older and are in busier life stages, they just don't have time for it. Yeah. So clearly it's shifting out of mobile and it's shifting to the cloud. And that's where all the growth is going to be. So any company that's caught in between is really challenged. And generally they don't cut the expenditures on the old stuff back enough. They keep thinking they can revive it or maintain it. And then you end up having this triage because the revenue is always disappointing, the margins are always disappointing, and you're always spending too much money. And then they don't focus enough on the new areas. So I think almost all of the big companies are guilty of that. Where
are educational games? This is not taken off in popularity. Maybe they wrote this question before you. So.
Well, in fact, the way we're going to approach it is that some of you may have seen the very depressing film Waiting for Superman. Yeah. So if your first move is to go try to sell something at scale into the formal classroom in public schools, you would fail. What we're going to do is we're going to start in the consumer market. There are plenty of concerned consumers that want to help their kids. Okay. And then while we're doing that, and that helps float the boat, we're going to do some research in aftercare environments that are not as formal, and get some research findings about efficacy, and then we'll go back to the schools more formally.
I like this one. What game would you want to create with the technology of 2023?
Well, I think by that time you're talking about really trying to fulfill things like Snow Crash and that's everybody's favorite fantasy with computers, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean,
although actually, I'm a big fan of Ready Player One. If you haven't read that, it's the gamers version of Snow Crash, but it's a much faster, lighter read.
Not done by Stevenson. I mean,
no,
I'll have to read it. And Ender's Game is coming soon.
Thank God it's not done by Stevenson. Okay. He's almost he's like programming an APL.
I know.
You can't even read it after you wrote it yourself.
He can write faster than I can read. So a very last question. Bird or Dr. J, who was your guy?
Oh, Dr. J, Julius, my man.
Thank you. You filled in a lot of the blanks for me. I really appreciate it.
As an undergrad at Harvard University, Trip Hawkins designed his own major in strategy and applied game theory. There are hundreds of stories like this at the Computer History Museum. Join us next time for the Computer History Museum presents Revolutionaries.